Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to the second of our two recordings dealing with the civil rights era, primarily focusing on the 1950s and 1960s. As I mentioned in the sort of introduction to the first recording, though, obviously this isn't to suggest that, well, we fixed everything in the 50s and 60s, and so now we've sort of moved on from that point. It just means that those 2 decades really see a significant sort of leap forward in a lot of respects, especially in terms of ways that civil rights legislation is enacted. So the official legal kinds of protections and that sort of thing. But obviously there are still issues with racism and intolerance and that kind of thing that unfortunately seem to kind of plague our country in a lot of ways. In our last session, we talked a little bit about, excuse me, the desegregation efforts dealing specifically with education, some of the issues in the 1940s and early 1950s that lead up to the real sort of growth of the civil rights movement, and then talked a little bit about Brown versus the Board of Education, and some of the challenges then that are faced as communities, especially in the southern states, tackle the question of desegregating public schools. But certainly, schools aren't the only thing that were segregated. They weren't the only area where we see sort of racial policy being expressed. And so there are other areas also in the mid-1950s where we can notice efforts at eliminating segregation as an attack on a particular legal form of sort of unequal behavior and inequality. Certainly, a very, very famous incident in that respect is the Montgomery bus boycott, right? People have probably heard the name Rosa Parks, even if you don't know precisely what it was that she did. The name has become one of those sort of iconic names in American history. Basically, Rosa Parks ends up being I don't want to say instigator, the sort of focal point for a concerted effort to desegregate the public transit system in Montgomery, Alabama. She refuses to give up the seat where she was riding on a public bus. She happened to be in a section reserved for African Americans, because at the time buses were segregated in terms of whites being able to sit, well, we'll put it this way. Whites could sit anywhere they wanted. African Americans had to sit in specific sections designated in the bus. If the white seats were all full and a white person wanted to sit in a black section, they could demand seating in that space, right? So she wasn't exactly breaking the law in the sense of where she was sitting on the bus. She refused to give up her seat to a white person that demanded it from her. She's arrested because this is technically against the law in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. And this leads then to a boycott. Black city leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King, end up organizing a boycott whereby the African American community refuses to ride on city buses. This is a very difficult boycott to enforce or to maintain, because public transit was the preferred, and in some cases only, method of getting around town for large numbers of low-income African Americans. The city then, sort of in response to the boycott, prohibits taxi drivers, many of whom were black, from lowering their fares to sort of help out the low-income individuals who still needed transportation from place to place. Taxi drivers weren't allowed to lower their fares in order to make it easier for those people who were now no longer riding buses to use taxis instead. This is one example, and I'll reference it again in the future, of a tactic that Dr. King uses to try to overwhelm the legal system as a, I don't want to say a punishment, that's sort of the wrong word, as a sort of a tactic to use in an effort to use the law against itself, right? To show how ridiculous the laws defining segregation are when the city would have to overwhelm its own court system in order to enforce those laws. So, excuse me, the boycott ends up lasting over a year. Eventually, the case rises all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then finds in support of the boycott and rules that segregated buses are illegal. This is one of a number of court cases that sort of deal with similar themes in terms of segregation and the process of gradually, piece by piece, breaking down those segregation laws, those Jim Crow laws in the United States. This boycott also propels not just Martin Luther King Jr. into the spotlight, but also propels the organization that he is really kind of at the head of, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, into being one of the major sort of organizational forces in the civil rights movement, especially in the late 50s and into the 1960s. So certainly very significant kinds of impact as a result of the Montgomery boycott. So Dr. King, who was he? Well, certainly most famous for the I Have a Dream speech, which we'll talk about in relation to the March on Washington in the summer of 1963. But he is really a fascinating character, fascinating figure from the standpoint of the types of philosophical, intellectual kinds of arguments that he makes dealing with integration and dealing with equal rights. He is influenced greatly by Mohandas Gandhi, a leader of a resistance movement in India in the mid and late 1940s especially, who also advocates nonviolence and civil resistance. He is a fan of a number of different theologians because he has his doctorate of divinity. And so he sort of blends Christian ethics with broader kinds of nonviolent ideologies to make some really interesting and very thought-provoking kinds of comments about the nature of integration, the nature of racism and intolerance and these kinds of things. Normally what he tries to do is to arrange large gatherings, large events, as a way to sort of force the hand of the authorities who are trying to enforce segregation laws. At the same time, he figures that this will help to gain the attention or the media focus, certainly, in order to kind of open the eyes of the American people to exactly what happens when these segregation laws are being enforced, right? The levels of violence and intimidation and police brutality that sort of go along with that. So King is definitely advocating a very particular form of the civil rights movement. He is certainly going to be the most famous, probably the most influential of the civil rights leaders at the time. But he is certainly not the only civil rights leader. He's not the only person who is thinking and speaking and writing about these issues. One of his contemporaries, who has a very different approach, a very different kind of understanding of race relations and sort of more specifically the idea of equality or civil rights in the United States, is Malcolm X. Malcolm X is born Malcolm Little. He takes the surname X to demonstrate that Little was not his name. It was a name that his ancestors had been given when they were enslaved. And so he takes the surname X to demonstrate that he never actually had from his perspective, a legitimate family name. He is radicalized into a sort of offshoot of the Islamic faith known as the Nation of Islam. And when he's released from prison in 1952, he starts to, within the kind of framework of the Nation of Islam, starts to speak out on behalf of a more kind of aggressive, more, at the time, kind of radical vision of black nationalism and racial separation. He and his father are both influenced by Marcus Garvey. So, mentioned Marcus Garvey back when we talked about the 1920s. He is very much a black nationalist for his generation, and his ideas then sort of filter down through the decades and make their way to be a recognizable kind of centerpiece for a lot of what Malcolm X is saying. He ends up then, as the civil rights movement starts to congeal more and more around the SCLC and Martin Luther King in particular, Malcolm X's message starts to sort of exist more on the fringes. And he is certainly an influential figure among large sections of the black population, but his message isn't going to really resonate too loudly until really towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, and then certainly after Martin Luther King's assassination. Over time, Malcolm X's message sort of moderates a little bit. He begins to run counter to the leader of the Nation of Islam, a guy named Elijah Muhammad. He then ends up renouncing the Nation of Islam, becomes, as I say, more moderate in his views about Islam as a faith, but then also his views about race relations, his views about the possibility of, I don't know if I want to say cooperation or, let's say, tolerance between whites and blacks in the United States. He still champions black pride. He still champions self-determination. He still carries with him those kinds of core ideologies, those core beliefs, but he is less kind of overtly assertive or aggressive in the way that he presents those kinds of ideas. It's hard to say what might have happened had Malcolm X continued in that path that he had sort of begun by 1963, 64, 65. He's assassinated early in 1965 when he is delivering a speech in New York City. Almost certainly the assassins were members of the Nation of Islam who were kind of exacting revenge on some of Malcolm X's statements, speaking out against Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And so it's one of those kind of interesting historical hypotheticals about, you know, where might the civil rights movement have gone had Malcolm X lived, and, you know, what kinds of connections or overlaps might there have ended up being with Dr. King and these sorts of things. But the fact is, Malcolm X is assassinated. He was never able to achieve the same level of influence, certainly during his life, the same level of influence as Martin Luther King Jr. And it's not going to be, in some respects, until after his death that some of his ideas start to gain broader traction as they start to get adopted by groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that will sort of be the leading edge of what will become the Black Panther movement and that sort of thing. So what kinds of efforts were being made to achieve different kinds of civil rights, whether it was integrating public spaces, whether it was encouraging African Americans to vote, securing their right to vote beyond just encouraging them to get out and do so. So there are a number of different things that take place. Some of them are more chronologically specific, right? Something like the Freedom Summer was a one-time event. But then there were things that happened on sort of a longer basis, right? So one of the kinds of civil disobedience that is very successful in terms of integrating, in this case, retail spaces, is what were known as sit-ins. And sit-ins are going to be a tactic that's going to be used by student protesters during the 1960s. Places like Columbia University or Berkeley, UC Berkeley. But basically it is a group of people who literally sit at a spot. In some cases, this is technically in violation of a particular law. In other cases, it's not necessarily breaking a law so much as it is causing an inconvenience for certain authorities. The sit-in movement in the civil rights context really gets going in Greensboro, North Carolina, and a lot of sit-ins, virtually all of them, but certainly not 100%, were the result of college students. Oftentimes, they are focused on lunch counters, right? So in the 1960s, there were a lot of different businesses that included just like little diner spaces inside their retail facility. So companies that were called things like Woolworths, Ben Franklin's, right, different places like that, oftentimes had some kind of a lunch counter where you could go in and you could get milkshakes and hot dogs and scrambled eggs or that kind of thing. More often than not, in southern states in particular, these places were segregated so that different parts of the lunch counter were reserved for different people, and these sit-ins then were an attempt to sort of peacefully overturn some of those policies. So sometimes these were actual community or local laws that were on the books. Sometimes these were the result of store policy. Sit-ins spread from 1960 deep into the decade, and so certainly they're not just a one-time or two-time thing. Same thing with what were known as freedom rides. So the freedom rides kick off in 1961, and basically what's happening here is people kind of following the lead of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery situation. In this case, interstate buses, such as Greyhound, would have to, as they're moving into, if they're driving, let's say, from Chicago into states that are segregated, those buses would have to stop as soon as they get into the state or before they get into the state, so that races on the bus would end up separating into different sections. So the freedom rides were an attempt to ride these buses through southern states without moving and without segregating where they were sitting, right? The people on the buses would stay where they were, and force then the kind of bus companies to end these segregationist policies, force as much as possible these local communities and these state governments to change the law. Freedom Summer is focused primarily on voter registration and encouraging voter turnout and protecting and preserving voters' ability to actually cast their ballots. This was primarily targeted at Mississippi, which was historically the worst state in the country in many ways regarding racial inequality, and certainly one of the worst in terms of voter suppression. And in this case, you have people from around the country, north and south, east and west, who sort of congregate and gather in Mississippi to hand out leaflets, to go door to door, to give sort of carpool opportunities to black voters so that they can get to the polls, so that they can get to voter registration sites and this kind of thing. It results in widespread white reaction, violent white reaction against these efforts. And so black churches are bombed, black volunteers and white volunteers are attacked physically, verbally. Buildings and sort of headquarters where these operations are being sort of arranged or organized from, they get attacked. 3 people, 3 volunteers are murdered as part of this white reaction to these efforts. It ends up being a very, very violent kind of an effort. Certainly it does bear some fruit, and certainly it helps to focus, once again, focus national attention on what's happening at the time. And it does, fortunately, to some extent, help lead to the passage in 1965 of the Voting Rights Act. And so that's going to be a significant kind of milestone in the attack on legal versions of segregation and legal versions of racial prejudice and intolerance. The photo on the top right is a photograph of the kind of lunch counter that I was talking about, right? Where you've got, you know, inside, I wouldn't call them a department store. It's certainly not a grocery store. There aren't really these kinds of things today, unfortunately, that I can relate it to easily, but it's a combination of a drugstore and soda shop and grocery store, and then also has these little lunch counters. But you can see this is just an example. In this case, it may have been staged. An example of the kind of tactic that's involved, right? It's literally just a matter of people going there, sitting at the stools, sitting at the lunch counter, and refusing to move. And so then it forces the hand of the store management, it forces the hand of local police authorities, and then sort of continuing to do this over and over and over again is going to stretch thin those resources of the authority figures who are trying to kind of enforce these policies or enforce these laws. The photograph then on the bottom left is probably the most famous, potentially one of the most famous moments in the civil rights movement, civil rights era, and that is the March on Washington. And the March on Washington happens at the end of August 1963. Basically, it is intended to kind of force the hand of Congress and President Kennedy. Kennedy in particular has kind of a mixed record at best on civil rights issues. And he kind of speaks a good game, but he doesn't necessarily achieve a whole lot in terms of measurable successes. Congress is, I wouldn't say dominated by Southerners, but certainly there is enough power from the Southern bloc in Congress that they're able to, by and large, sort of prevent or stifle significant civil rights legislation. And so there had been a civil rights bill in Congress that had been languishing there for years at this point. And so leaders of the civil rights movement, including people like Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most significant white organizers for this march is a labor leader, a man named Walter Reuther. And it is a huge, huge undertaking. Estimates of somewhere between 250 and 300,000 people are there. It takes a massive effort of coordinated transportation to guarantee that all of the people get to Washington, D.C. to participate and to attend. So airplanes are chartered, trains are chartered, buses are chartered and sort of arranged for, carpools, Hundreds of thousands of people then watch the proceedings. It's a day-long kind of an event. And certainly the most famous of the things that takes place during this is Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. So that is sort of the milestone part of the March on Washington, but it's not exactly the only thing, right? It kind of has transcended into being this really, really significant moment, and it is. But it's important to keep in mind that there are other people presenting, there are other kinds of speeches and songs and performances and messages that are being delivered at the time. After the march, after the demonstration wraps up, many of the leaders who had organized it end up meeting with the president at the White House. The March on Washington is sometimes given a certain amount of credit for helping to sort of grease the wheels to encourage passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although the Civil Rights Act is going to be passed almost a year later, so it's not like we can point to the March on Washington and say, well, you know, we can look at that and they did this and boom, boom. Right after that, then Congress managed to actually get the Civil Rights Act through. Not quite as one thing leads to another as all that. So the Civil Rights Act, this is perhaps the most significant, certainly 20th century piece of legislation designed to eliminate segregation, eliminate discrimination in as many areas of public life as possible. So it is a huge law. It is, in many ways, the responsibility of John F. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, who is largely responsible for pushing this bill through Congress, right? Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963, and Kennedy never really had enough pull in Congress to leverage passage of a law like this. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, had been a pretty powerful figure in the U.S. Senate, in the House first, but then in the Senate for quite some time. So he knew what buttons to push and what strings to pull in order to secure passage of this bill. It is eventually passed July 2nd, 1964, and it is a law that over time will also be extended to include other kinds of issues of discrimination and sort of unequal access, let's say. But it deals with protecting people's rights to fair employment, fair housing, certain aspects of education, certain aspects of voting protections. A wide range of different kinds of things are covered as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Initially, it didn't have a lot of power behind it in terms of a mechanism to enforce these kinds of requirements. Those powers and those sort of enforcement capacities then are going to be enhanced over time. But it doesn't necessarily tackle all of the problems that appear in sort of the voting arena, right? And so that's the responsibility of another law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is passed a little over a year later. It's a little easier for Congress to pass this law, partially because the Civil Rights Act had already broken that barrier in some ways. The idea of this is to prevent discrimination and suppression of voting rights. So it's intended to ban practices like literacy tests or other grandfather clauses, different kinds of laws that were set up in southern states in particular that were specifically geared towards preventing certain groups, but especially blacks, from voting. It is extremely successful at opening up opportunities for voter registration and then for people to actually vote on election days. Over time, though, and recently in the last 10 years or so, there have been provisions of the Voting Rights Act that have been struck down, and there have been a number of commentators who have pointed out their concern that this might ultimately backfire and make it easier once again for certain voting groups to be sort of kept away from the polls and that sort of thing. And there are certainly instances of that happening in recent electoral cycles over the last 5 to 10 years as well, and even more recently than that. So between the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, these are two monumental pieces of legislation that are designed to open up opportunities and eliminate as much of the race-based discrimination and segregation as possible that existed in the United States at the time. And in many ways, it's going to contribute to the legal kinds of guarantees of equality. But as Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, there's a difference between creating laws or abolishing laws that deal with equality versus changing people's attitudes about race. And ultimately, that's where the real challenge is going to emerge. So you have these huge achievements in the mid-1960s that will, in some ways, be acquiring a lot of the specific goals that the civil rights movement was pushing for. But then the question becomes, well, now that we have addressed issues of access to the vote, issues of equal employment, equal housing, et cetera, what do we look at next? And so what we notice then in the later part of the 1960s is a bit of a kind of a transition as the civil rights movement starts to push in different directions. They start to look at the wage gap. In other words, certain people and certain groups that end up being paid less than others. They look at official and informal limits or restrictions on where people are able to live in communities, housing restrictions, zoning restrictions, what's known as redlining, which is sort of an informal process by which certain groups of people are prevented from living in certain neighborhoods or certain communities. There's also the question, increasingly, of the unequal numbers of minorities who are serving in the Vietnam War. And this is a result of a number of factors. We'll touch on that in more detail when we get into the Vietnam War in the next section. But it is definitely a concern. Martin Luther King Jr., he begins to kind of refocus. He starts to arrange sort of an outgrowth of the civil rights movement, which is increasingly focused on poverty more than it is on race. Certainly there are big overlaps there, but his main concern is more dealing with poverty than it is with specifically racial kinds of concerns. He is assassinated in April of 1968. He's in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's there supporting a labor strike by the sanitation union in Memphis as part of this effort to address questions of equal employment, equal wages, poverty, those kinds of things. He's assassinated in April of 1968. So this contributes then to I don't want to say a collapse in the civil rights movement, because that does a disservice to what is happening at the time and what happens afterwards. And to some extent, it kind of overstates the sort of centrality of Martin Luther King Jr. in the movement. But certainly it has an impact. And one of the impacts is King's death ends up contributing a little bit, at least, to the opportunity for a more radical kind of black nationalism to emerge as a significant force in the movement for equality. And this is in some ways an outgrowth of an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. By 1966-67 or so, it has begun to sort of take a much more aggressive position in terms of the civil rights movement. And by the late 1960s, it is beginning to break into its own organization, the Black Panther Party. But more generally speaking, this can be included under the umbrella of Black Power or Black nationalism. It is, in many ways, an outgrowth of some of the ideas of Marcus Garvey, some of the ideas of Malcolm X, advocating racial pride, advocating an increased focus on self-determination and self-sufficiency. It is suggesting that the black community, because of a lack of interest, because of a lack of willpower, because of a lack of effectiveness from white efforts to provide resources, and also because, ideologically speaking, this is seen by many as a handout, right? That this is another example of paternalism. It's a patronizing kind of a thing, that whites feel that it's their responsibility to provide assistance for blacks, that blacks aren't capable of doing these things on their own. And so it says the black community should be able to sort of achieve on its own, right? It should lift itself up, it should be able to lift itself up, it should have the opportunities to lift itself up through its own social programs, dealing with its own challenges, confronting its own struggles, and that sort of thing. And it does include then a certain amount of policing the police as part of the ideology that says the police department isn't in the business of protecting blacks so much as it is protecting whites and protecting white property. And if that's the case, then the black community has every right to arrange for its own protection until such time as the police enforce the law equally, and until such time as the police achieve colorblindness in the way that they enforce the law as well. So this is really kind of where the civil rights movement heads in the 1960s. This is where we're going to kind of pause. Again, this isn't to suggest that the movement is no longer needed or that it's no longer relevant. It's not to suggest that post-1960s and early 1970s things just kind of evaporate. Certainly there are changes in the country that sort of adjust the national focus in some ways away from civil rights. There is a certain amount of belief among a lot of whites in particular that says, well, you know, they got what they deserved, they got their freedom and their equality, and what else is there? You know, we might as well just consider that everything has been taken care of and, you know, move on from there, which is certainly not the case. But for our purposes, if we continued, it would end up, unfortunately, kind of overwhelming our class, and we need to move on to other things in order to move further into the 20th century. So this is where we're going to pause in terms of treating the civil rights movement. Our next section then will be looking at some of the broader kinds of social, cultural, political developments of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So I hope you're all doing really, really well. Please be sure that you're on top of the PowerPoints on Blackboard in addition to these recordings. Let me know if you have questions about anything at all. I'll be happy to help out with that. And I will talk to you all soon.